The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast. See, Derick Varn is the guest this week. Varn is a reader at Zero Books, a university lecturer and teacher, a poet, and a frequent guest on this podcast and many others. This week we discuss the contradictions in liberalism and debate whether the goal of Marx was to realize or abandon liberal values. It's Wednesday, August 16th, 2017, and I'm Douglas Lane, the publisher of Zero Books and the host of this podcast. If you're looking for some books to help you understand the current political crisis we're in, we at Zero Books have just the reading list for you. Edmund Berger's Uncertain Future provides a detailed look into the economic and political conditions behind the Trump era from a Marxist perspective. Chris Ninem's How the Establishment Lost Control offers an upbeat explanation for Corbynism and Brexit both. Anselm Japp's The Writing on the Wall is a collection of essays that bring an understanding of Marx's value theory to bear on political questions. And Angela Nagel's Kill All Normies explains how the online culture war added fuel to the fire of right-wing reaction. If you enjoy the podcast, consider joining the Zero Books Club. Zero Books Club members receive access to a Saturday podcast entitled Inside Zero Books, which sometimes features the second half of conversations with Zero Squared guests, and sometimes features conversations with Zero Books readers about the state of the left. The music you're listening to right now is Fife and Drum, music of the American Revolutionary War, but in just a moment, you'll be listening to C. Derick Varn deconstruct liberal values. What are we going to talk about? Are we going to talk about how I've been soft on the DSA? Are we going to talk about...
We've all been soft on the DSA. I mean, like, me holding you accountable for that would be kind of hypocritical. I mean, you've been soft on liberalism, but, like, you know, that's nothing new. Maybe we should talk about, you know, we have a lot of bitch sessions about the current moment. And you asked me a couple weeks ago to define the difference between morality and ethics. And I said, well, if we're going to do that, we should really break down a whole bunch of categories. And I think in breaking this down, we can talk about liberalism in its crisis, which I think it's really in one. Yeah. The right, and who knows what the hell leftism is anymore. So
can I start by just giving my standard definition of the difference between left and right? Okay, now this is just Zizek's definition, but I consider the left to be people who look to our current society and see inequality, or who see injustice or immorality, and don't blame an outside force or some alien intruder, but turn instead to the structure of the system itself and the society itself for answers, to see that the whatever criminality there might be in a society, or whatever injustice there might be in society, it's often produced by the very terms and structures that give us our sense of what justice is, or give us what's the sense of what lawful behavior is. So I consider that to be the left perspective, and the right perspective is one which shouldn't be ignored, because it's the one which tries to hold on to standards, but tends to view the violations of those standards as coming from the outside.
All right.
How does that, does that work at all for you?
Sort of. I mean, the thing is that makes most leftists actually rightist and so on.
Yeah. Well, I'm comfortable with that, although it's not particularly helpful in the everyday, talk.
Right. I mean, I actually have said, many times that if you were looking at the psychological function of both liberals and leftists today, they are in general reactionary. And what I mean by that is not that there's some kind of coherent reactionary politics, like, say, the alt-right or anything like that, but that they spend all their time reacting and setting the terms of both political engagement, debate, and whatever. I mean, even talking about geopolitics in terms of things that already exist and defending things that already exist, even though, the project of socialism as it was understood by, even non-Marxists, is largely, out the window, even in places that claim to be socialist. And you do get to interesting questions about, say, like China and, the contradictions of a society where about 60% of capital is owned by the state, yet its capitalists have about 50% of global controlling shares of the, 10 dominant companies that own everything. So, those are fascinating contradictions to get into. But even then, you're like parsing hairs, because what you're trying to do, if you even bring that up, is trying to defend China's possibility of transitioning to socialism, which again is frankly reactionary because it is reactive. Now, I'm using words in a different way here. So, I don't mean like it's reactionary politics. I mean, it's just letting the terms of society as it currently exists dictate everything to you. Where we're at right now, I think, and, you and I have had some minor disagreements online publicly about our relationship to liberalism, but this is where we need to break some stuff down. Where we're at right now is a place where people who call themselves the left are in some ways the most right-wing they've ever been. People, and I don't just mean the ID pole / social justice people.
No, I know.
Okay,
I know.
I also mean the new ranking, workerism that's social democratic and on all that. What I'm going to say here, I think, is going to upset a lot of your listeners, and maybe even upset you. The first thing we have to be honest about is parsing Marx is super important. Don't get me wrong about that. But politics is not a debate society. And the first thing we have done is tried to insist on a clarity in our founding corpus that frankly cannot be there. And I mean it cannot be there because if it was that clear, there would not be contradictory answers to basic questions to almost every single major point of Marxism.
Can you give me an example?
Do we get rid of the division of labor?
Okay, good.
Is party the same as class? Can class lead party or this party lead class? Is there anything outside of capitalism? Does it determine our consciousness? If it doesn't determine our consciousness, why are things so limited? If it does, how can you special plead any member of it out of the problem? I could just answer you, like, we don't even agree on what proletariat means. I mean, it's something as basic as that. We don't agree on what value is. Now, I think that there's a clear answer to in Marx, but it's not a simple answer, or we would have never had the disagreement in the first place. And I am one of the things I differ from both Althusser and the Marxist humanists, and like, I don't agree with either side of the debate, but I actually think there is a subtle but important difference in perspective if you focus on the Communist Manifesto than if you focus on Das Kapital. Because the Communist Manifesto is much more optimistic than Das Kapital is. And I'm not the first person to even say that. I mean, I think Gramsci was big on saying that. But to get back, so we got all these problems. Now, the other thing we have to clarify is there is a dialectical relationship, and I hate using that term almost now because Marxists sometimes use it as if that's magic, as if it's getting out of an argument, between Marxism and liberalism. Marxism emerges from liberalism. There's no two questions about that. All right. Marx comes out of study of Hegel. Engels was a friggin' minor military leader in 1848. I mean, you know, they were both initially optimistic about liberal reforms. Whether or not we are still transcending liberalism, saving liberalism, or anything like that depends on three things. What is liberalism now? Do you think ideas are actually what is primarily at hand? And are these abstractions coherent enough to have those kinds of clear relationships? And I think, frankly, in the case of liberalism has mutated and morphed so much because of its own internal contradictions. And its internal contradictions, to me, go back to prior to capitalism. All right. And we can get into what I think about that a little bit more, but that those things have generated obviously self-contradictory ideas. And Marxists, by and large, whether they're rejecting liberalism or tailing it, are frankly letting that incoherence lead the agenda. And I think that's true across the board. So, let's get into specifics as you feel the need to, but that's my first assertion.
I want to talk about, now this, in a way, this is a move that I'm about to make that might lead us off track or lead us down a road that we've been down lots of times. So I want to discuss this, but I want to come to a conclusion about it if we can, about the importance of the difference between ideas and activity, and whether or not what is significant is how we develop our ideas right now. So I just want to assert, and I think that I can back this up, that developing ideas and then acting on them is the only sensible way to approach political change. That you can't, if you have an undeveloped idea and act, you're not going to be able to assess very well what's happened after you act.
You're an idealist. As I've said many times, because that's not how history works. Okay. No one pre-planned capitalism. No one even pre-planned liberalism. Everything that created liberalism existed before. None of it was coherent, and none of it was ever viewed and argued coherently until it already started to exist. So we have that. That does not mean that I think that ideas aren't important, but what it means is that we cannot possibly think all this through.
No, I agree.
There is no way to do that.
Right. I agree with you there. You can't think everything through. You can't develop a perfect computer model. You can't see the consequences of what you're going to do in advance.
I mean, there's a lot of people right now on our side who literally think that communism is liberalism plus workers' democracy plus central planning.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, and that just doesn't make any sense to me. Like,
but in order to know that doesn't work, you have to at least be able to think through enough to see why it doesn't work and what you're trying to change, right? I mean,
right. But I think, but you and I get our distinctions, and this is a subtle distinction. I think ideas matter, but they are never what's driving things. Like, you and I used to talk about the base and the superstructure all the time because it's a crude metaphor. And it is a crude metaphor. But let's think about this. And we kind of came up with this analogy maybe 2 years ago, and we're going to bring it back up. You can think whatever you want. All right. there are all kinds of ideas in history that are completely lost because there was no material basis for their maintenance.
Right.
You can go into fun micro histories, like that one by Carlo about the guy who was burnt at a stake for arguing that the universe was made of moldy cheese. I mean, and that seems laughable, but many ideas that do take on because they have a material basis for whatever reason, not usually even related to the ideas themselves, can survive, where something like that, it's just, we can learn about it, and there might be people who believe it as a fluke or as a lifestyle, who knows? But the likelihood that it'll ever survive and sustain itself is just not there. And so in that sense, I guess I'm kind of arguing for an intellectual Darwinism, that these ideas, we could think them through. If we don't think them through, things are going to go badly, but we can think them through and they still go badly. I mean, that's one of the things that I think we have to really get in our head. The fact that our ideas may be good or coherent or make sense doesn't actually, it matters, but it's not going to be what causes us to win or lose. You're not going to think your way to a revolution.
Okay. Well, I think you're saying a bunch of different things, seeming to say the same thing. Especially that last one, you're not going to think your way to a revolution. That's true. One of the reasons that's true is because a revolution requires mass activity. Simply having a rational, coherent argument isn't going to necessarily move the masses, right? I mean, that's, I think a lot of organizers get really tripped up on that idea because they think, well, then we'll just tell them what they want to hear to get them to move, right? Sure. I come back to Göbekli Tepe. I think it's I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. This really old temple that hunter-gatherers created out of a religious impulse, which then led them to develop agriculture. They didn't have a material basis for their temple. They had to develop one after they had made this move, based on some sort of spiritual foundation, some sort of religious belief. Look, it survived long enough for them to build a temple and to live for a while, right? So
right, but that had to have some kind of other function. I mean, this is the thing when you parse out these ancient religious ideas. Yeah. I mean, ancient peoples, as far as I can tell, were by no means stupid. I mean, they use their brains in ways we have trouble even fathoming. If you study hunter-gatherers now, you'll see that. Yeah. But the distinction between what they did for religious reasons and what they did for practical reasons, I think it's very hard to parse out, which is not to say I disagree with you, but I think I just say you have to look at this dialectically, because a lot of those weird, say, solar myths are actually pretty helpful for knowing when the fuck you need to change your crops. I mean, right. or when you need to change, if you're talking about hunter-gatherers.
When you need to move, when you need to go somewhere else.
When you need to move. Right. Yeah. So having a permanent basis would be based on something, but it probably would lead to other things. I think in this sense, when we talk about the dialectics of history, we have to realize that there's always ideas in tension. And you and I have agreed that, Marxists who claim, and many Marxists have, that we are going to answer, and end the dialectical movement of history through, I guess, central planning or whatever. I don't know. I just don't think that works. There's always opposed ideas and contradictions you don't see.
Yeah.
Let's then clarify a little bit more where we think the problem is. So I told you the other day or yesterday, Abe, and I called you, I don't know, you said it's hard to crypto level. And I said that your liberalism was showing through, but you had a point that Marx was trying to defend, say, a lot of what the liberal bourgeois revolutions of the 17th century were trying to bring about: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Mm-hmm. However, Marx in a document that you yourself put to just the day before.
Yeah.
talks about how those ideas are impossible, and that they were always going to become formal, and that's what they were. And the point wasn't to defend, say, for example, people always talk about the tension in modern politics is between liberty and equality. Okay, that might be true. Conservatives like to say that. Liberals sometimes even like to say it too, except that capitalism, even though it's based on the idea of individual liberty, discreetly abrogates individual liberty eventually. One, and two, anyone who reads Marx and reads what he has to say about bourgeois equity realizes that he mocks it as being formal because it's impossible because people are different, and it's just not a category that even applies. It can only apply in a formal sense.
Well, I always thought that the realization of real liberty would be to understand how the formal structures you create set up the terms of your liberty, and holding open the possibility of changing those formal structures when you find contradictions and problems in your notions of liberty, or when you feel constrained and you haven't achieved the liberty that you desire using these formal structures. So maybe this is the trot in me, this kind of idea of a permanent revolution, not really a permanent violent revolution, but a society in which is aware of its own involvement in creating the formal structures that sets up its identity, is what I would be striving after in terms of to develop real freedom. Not that in any given moment you would have real freedom, but that you would be aware that whatever structures you devise will always be open for revision and fundamental change as they've been found wanting.
What Marx talks about in the Brumaire, which I think is sometimes wildly optimistic, is that, and this is what I talk about, what I mean if you pick up Capital, I do think there is a real difference in thought that is not easily reconciled. And I'll get to that. So if you pick up the Brumaire, and he talks about, in the past, humans, we can change history collectively because we can now set up the social context for our own development. We are aware enough to do that. Mm-hmm. That is the argument of the Brumaire. That is, however, hard to glean from reading Das Kapital. Mm-hmm. Now, Marx still seems to think that it's inevitable. Like, he didn't write Das Kapital and then walk away from socialist politics. He died working with Engels on the Erfurt program. But if you really think about the tension between that optimism of we can control all of this, we can plan it, we can do it together, but our material relations are always manifest and subjugated, and they become completely abstractified over time. And then the longer capitalism goes on, the worse that's going to be. I don't think that there are easy conclusions about what Marxists should do. And I actually do think this was apparent immediately in the way that Engels and Kautsky both tried to clarify that tension.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where the idea of the Vanguard Party came from. And that goes all the way back. I mean, it's articulated most clearly in Kautsky. And, Kautsky points out things that are true. One of the things about Kautsky is he argues that, look, if you were to just have a general strike and shut everything down, you're going to do two things. One, you're going to lose unless you already have a ton of power, because even if you shut down production, the capitalists by necessity have more stores of the goods you made than you do. They can wait you out.
Right.
If you have an army that can steal those back, you might as well go ahead and seize the entire apparatus of the state and production, because that's the kind of size army you need to do that anyway. And thus, you should skip the stage of general strike. Now,
yeah.
I bring that up to talk about this new resurgent workerism that everybody seems to have.
Yeah.
And this focus on the state. One, I think Kautsky was like, we can't destroy, we have to smash the state, but we can't, well, that was Lenin, but you can't completely destroy the state because we need its infrastructure to subsume to make communism happen. Mm-hmm. But there were other communists who were picking up on other things that Marx wrote, and I think Das Kapital is one of them, is if the bourgeois state's logic is bourgeois, like, sure, you can seize its means of production and its logistics strange, but if you don't completely obliterate it, then it's going to bourgeois. That's what it does. It's what it's designed for. That's who set up its teleos.
Right.
Now, I don't think that's clear in Marx one way or the other, frankly.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that or not, actually.
Right. I don't think there's a clear answer in Marx on that question. So that's why I brought up, like, we have to first face that there are some questions that Marx isn't going to answer for us.
Yeah.
Two, we need to clarify what our values are, what our historical conditions are, what our relations to other groups are, and what the larger political economy is. And those are all separate questions. And none of them are going to drive success by themselves, which is what I was trying to get to earlier.
Right.
So how would you define morality, Doug?
Okay. I would define morality as the personal decisions and actions that you take inside an ethos, and the extent to which you are moral is the extent to which you abide by an ethos that you find yourself agreeing with. Maybe that's not a very good definition, but that's how I define morality is you're moral to the extent that you live by the principles of your society, which are your own.
Right. So that makes politics moral or immoral, or is that just a separate question?
Politics can be moral, but they aren't always. There usually are tensions between what the ethics of society demands and what the material basis of society demands. I mean, that's why we have such a thing as real politics, right? You're often called upon to violate the very ethics of your society in order to maintain the society.
Right. So that means we have to understand. So ethics is basically, what are you saying, a social convention, or it's
yeah, ethics is a cultural, social convention set up to in the service of a social world. I mean, they're not meant to be in opposition to the operations of material reality. They just end up being that way because they can never fully. They're aimed at dictating the behavior of groups and individuals and setting the terms of that behavior and giving values to those behaviors. But they're not aimed at the practical side of life necessarily. Like, for instance, what comes to mind is, you can have an ethics about what kind of food you eat. That in your morality is to the degree to which you abide by those ethics. But material conditions can change so that abiding by those ethics becomes self-destructive. Not necessarily symbolically self-destructive. In fact, there's a certain kind of heroism in starving to death based on your morality and ethics. But, a politician's job isn't to be a hero. A politician's job is to maintain this political order in society. And so they're often going to end up being unethical in the face of changing material conditions.
Right. So let's ask ourselves then another question, and we'll get to how this all relates to your three core values in liberalism in a minute. Yeah. If we accept that ethics and politics are interrelated but are not the same, and then will always be at tension in some way, depending on the conflict between enacting values and in a person and enacting values in a society. Mm-hmm. All right. We then bring us to our next category. Why has liberalism in the last 20 years moved itself largely to the legal, which is defensive and reactive framework, as opposed to the political framework proper? It doesn't set the law, it defends through the law. And also, why has most of its activists basically rely almost solely on moral and ethical appeals and not political ones, meaning that it's mainly shaming that is the primary non-legal method of even encouraging people to fucking vote for them.
Right.
So what in liberty, equality, and fraternity leads to that?
Okay. Well, I don't think there's something in liberty, equality, and fraternity that leads to that.
I do.
I think the fact that we have a material foundation for our society, which quickly necessitates the violations of those ethics, perpetually necessitates the violation of those ethics, that leads to that. The political problem and the material problem are seen as wedded, basically. I mean, although I don't think they are as much as we think. But so my when I say that the goal of socialism is to realize these ethical concepts, what I mean is the goal of socialism is to change the material foundations of society so that it is less often running up against in opposition to its own values.
Okay, so I would say two things to that. I think that the opposition, the tension between group identity and collective identity and the ideas around equality and fraternity and liberty are manifested in this confusion. It is not unique to modern liberalism. It goes all the way back to Robespierre and the Mountain. And I'm going to criticize, people, defending the Jacobins has become, they were the first secularists. No, they weren't. The Kildee Rajets and the atheists. They were, proto-Marxist, not really. They killed less people than the American Revolution. They executed more, less died in the war. Right. I mean, I point all this out because that conflict between, the witch hunt and all that happens immediately. It is not just modern. It is innate to any of those ideas manifested in the material world, even before capitalism was fully instantiated.
Okay, yeah, you're probably right about this. But I'm glad to have this pointed out. So go on. I'm not. This is not. Yeah. But it's not a point for me where, like, I'm going to live or die on this battlefield. I'm glad to be corrected about some of the.
But let's talk about though what we want to defend. So, for example, I believe in a free press.
Yeah.
I believe, there's reasons why. In fact, there's Marx's arguments why is my argument for why. I need to know what my enemies think.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they will, even if it's not just legal free press, even if it's from social shaming, they will organize in secret and be more influential in secret than they are in the public. And I'm sorry if liberals and leftists have somehow missed that exactly happening in two different countries in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
I mean, so those ideas were more powerful and they were building. Now the funny thing is the alt-right success pretty much killed it. But that's the way these things go. Even with us, like if we were ever to actually, Marxism is a far more ambitious project, let's be honest. But if it was actually to succeed, the need for Marxists goes away.
Yeah. Right.
Like we aren't needed anymore.
Right. Which I'm fine with. I'd love to just write novels and,
Yeah. The abolition of Marxists. It'd be so great. I wouldn't have to argue all the time. I could just do what I'm going to do.
You'd find something to argue about. Come on.
Yeah, but not with you bastards. I'd argue about something that really didn't matter. So, you know, let's go ahead and set that aside for a second. So if we see these contradictions in play and we ask ourselves I think if you read Hegel, you actually get to the point where what Hegel and Adam Smith and those people didn't see, and then they don't have the same justifications for their liberalism, and they write at different points. All right. But is they didn't see that this is where you're right. The material manifestation making those contradictions as bad as they were. Right. And you see this in the transition of inequality and also in growth of economy between agrarian capitalism, which is the earliest form, agrarian and merchant capitalism, and where you have, you know, you go from a no growth economy like feudalism to a low growth economy like agrarian capitalism, like 1% growth a year, right? That's unsustainable now, but that was like, you know, that was the best that could be done. The moment industrialization and the incentives of that are introduced, and that comes naturally from trying to, you know, it's just once you add science and individual liberty together, you start developing these things. The acceleration of that inequality increases dramatically, which is what Marx saw, which is why Marx both condemns and also praises Adam Smith. Right. All right. I mean, the thing about, I'm not to say that Marx's categories are actually Adam Smith's categories, but the thing about the critique of political economy is he still thought Smith was better than most of the socialists he was arguing with. Right. You know, including Perhune, Eichmann, and all those. I mean, he had actually preferred Adam Smith to that. Right. So what he saw was the acceleration of those values being materially manifested in the kinds of disparities and lack of access that you saw in the early Industrial Revolution. And the proletariat was, frankly, more immiserated at that time than it is now. Okay, so now,
I want to hold and mention something I think we should come back to, which is earlier, but we should come back to, because I want to ask you a different question after I mention this. A while ago, I pointed out that it seemed to me that the Marxists, the real radical Marxists, were more likely to support Hillary Clinton and neoliberal politics than the Social Democrats were. And I was surprised by that. And I thought it was a huge mistake. I still think it is a mistake. But if you think about how Marx preferred Adam Smith to some of the socialists that he was arguing with, it's not inconsistent for Marxists to align themselves with neoliberal politics over if their choice is between that and the kind of socialism of Bernie Sanders. Is that a stretch?
Yeah, I guess it's not a stretch. And let's actually talk about this for a second.
Do you want to talk about this for a minute? Okay, because I have
because I think it's related. But ask your question, and then maybe
my question is: can we go back after we discuss this, or now? Can we go back to liberty, equality, fraternity, and can you point out some of the internal contradictions on the level of value, not as the values relate to material conditions, but in and of themselves, the internal contradictions in, say, equality or fraternity? Because I think that is really a core of your critique of liberal modernity, and I think it is a critique of liberal modernity that isn't from the left. I mean, I'm not saying it's reactionary or not, but it may be true, but it's not really a left critique. It's a critique of liberal modernity that stands aside from what I think of anyway as a Marxist critique. Am I wrong there? And do you want to elaborate on that?
I
guess it's in the critique of equality is probably in Marx. The critique of fraternity may not be. I'm not sure.
No, I think fraternities but the thing is that fraternity is also the only value of the three that everyone agrees on. Like nobody, well, maybe libertarians, I take that back. Almost nobody attacks fraternity. But because fraternity is not the same thing as collectivism.
Right.
Like if you, so let's talk about what and maybe it is an aside thing. Maybe I'm like meta Marxist to the point I'm not on the left anymore. Who knows? But let's talk about what I mean here.
Okay.
The internal contradiction between liberty is liberty for whom, and that is always the case. Liberty for the wolves is deaf to the sheep, as Isaiah Berlin said. He wasn't wrong. Is it liberty to or liberty from? These questions are never answered because they aren't easily answered. And obviously everybody has elements of both, although, conservatives and libertarians will try to tell you that it means liberty from until you ask them how they got their property.
And actually, just to go a step further, philosophically, the concept of liberty is one that, if you align it with the concept of free will, is very inconsistent and difficult to pin down at the very best,
Right. So it's a free moving, and we've already talked about ad nauseum the critique of equality is just that it's an abstract category that, when applied to people with differences, will always lead you into kind of formal traps. Fraternity is pretty much clear; it just means everybody trying to get along with each other, more or less.
Right.
So no, I don't think there's a critique of the fraternity. I don't even know that, but I don't think fraternity is the new value, except for, I guess. And maybe Marx is critiquing fraternity here because part of the fraternity in equalite was to get rid of classes, right? But also it was to make classes get along while they did it, which is something Marx doesn't think is possible.
Right. I mean, the thing about fraternity is that it never goes away, even in the most authoritarian, unequal, draconian societies. The fraternities, hell, if you go to a university, the worst place to be is in a fraternity, right? I mean, so fraternity just means getting along with your social group.
Right.
Right. So that leaves aside, what is your social group? I mean, how do you find fraternity, and spread that out as far as you can to the all of mankind? I mean, that's the socialist goal. It's also a Christian goal. And that's what we mean by fraternity. When liberals speak of it, they don't mean tribalism. They mean fraternity for your fellow human being of all kinds.
Then again, when you define a fellow human being historically, there's always immediately a state of exception given. Yeah. And that was something that Carl Schmitt said, but you see it even in John Locke. What was the first thing John Locke justified after justifying that people had rights through their own self-ownership? He justified the rights to own other people.
Right.
I mean, that was like the defense of liberty, of self autonomy as a defense of self property became immediately a defense of owning others as property.
Right.
I mean, and I say immediately, it didn't take long at all.
Right.
Also, the special pleading about land use, but not counting what other groups did as use, so you could effectively steal land from other groups. I mean, that's, and I say that because I don't want to. One of the biggest contradictions in modern liberalism and leftism is all this time spent talking about the rights of ownership over both culture and land of prior people, just because they were there first, without ever explaining why we would respect ownership of anything.
Right.
Okay, so what does it mean for a group to own something when you don't even believe in individual ownership? How does this make any sense?
Yeah.
And then when you apply it to an abstraction such as culture or whatever, it gets even worse. But the incoherence that people gripe about in cultural appropriation or whatever was already in many of our notions of who has the right to land, our imperialism.